It was a dark and stormy October evening. Gracie was curled up on her couch watching horror movies.
Do you think they know I like horror movies yet?
Yes, you literally made a video about it.
Oh, okay. Good.
She was excited to get into the autumn spirit and getting ready to eat her pumpkin cookies when suddenly... Gracie carefully got up to see who it was. But no one was there. Relieved, she turned to her couch, only to find...
I'll only return your pumpkin cookies if you make a video about trends in horror movies throughout Tim.
Time. They ran out of ease.
This was printed. Okay.
What do you think of when you think about horror movies? Unknown men in the woods holding machetes? Vampires in black and white film? Aliens? Ominous shapes holding knives in the most inconvenient manner? What about sci-fi and fantasy? Probably elves, wizards, and dragons, and spaceships, aliens, and blasters. For fantasy and sci-fi respectively, each of the elements of the genre can cohesively go in one film together. For horror, aliens, vampires, and ominous shapes holding agricultural tools don't exactly mix in one film. Unless you're watching a film that comments on the genre as a whole, such as A Cabin in the Woods or a Scary Movie. Horror loves its tropes, hence the existence of so many films that comment on the genre in the first place. But it's also one of the most distinctly diverse genres, making it very hard to pin down into one set box. You can say how it behaves, evokes fear, disgusts viewers, pushes the bounds of the human condition. But what about the parts that make it up? What does horror look like? Is horror the decrepit old cabin or the lavish new mansion? Is horror the modern, phone-centric world of bodies, 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 or the medieval world of the Army of Darkness? Does it look desaturated or neon? Although you know when to label a setting as horror, it's hard to say what setting is horror, because there is no one real setting that encapsulates the genre, like fantasy in their medieval Renaissance type world. Horror covers a wide berth of settings, time periods, and aesthetics. Horror is even one of the few genres that can be tacked on to just about any other genre. Historical horror, like The Witch or The Vitch, whatever you want to call it. Sci-fi horror, like Jason X or Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Fantasy horror, like Season of the Witch. Heck, even romance horror, like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and The Shape of Water, if you want to count those. Despite the genre's resistance to fit into categories, it does live to follow its trends. All art is influenced by the world it is created in, reflecting circumstances such as war, politics, culture, and social issues. But horror movies glaringly reflect the world they were created in, highlighting not only something so visceral as what a society fears, as people love to point out, but also what it aspires to, what it values, and what it wants to uphold. It is reflected in the faces of the monsters and their victims, the source of the fear, and the manifestation of the feeling of horror itself within the movies. Film as an artistic medium has only existed for a bit more than a decade, and in that time, horror has shifted and changed and focused on a vast variety of ideas and topics. So without further ado, here is a brief overview of horror trends in America throughout time. Note, this is a big oversimplification of historical trends in horror. There were many micro-trends and international trends at play as well, but trying to cover all of those in addition would be a whole video within itself. There's also a lot of overlap in trends, so there's often no real definitive start or end of a movie trend. This is just for fun. It doesn't matter. The birth of horror. Most people skip this era of horror movies and start talking about horror trends with the Golden Age, but the beginning of the horror genre is important. The film most widely recognized as the first horror film came in 1896, titled Le Manoir du Diable, which translates to The Haunted Castle or The House of the Devil in English. I probably didn't pronounce that right, but I also mispronounced like 5 words from my native language in my first video, so it's just a me problem. This film was silent and in black and white, featuring bats, cauldrons, and the devil himself. Although these elements are pretty horror, this wasn't really the jumpstart to the genre it sounds like. The film is 3 minutes long and was one of approximately 500 short films done by George Méliès, who was most interested in trick film, a sort of cinematic sleight of hand. From this time until approximately 1906, film as a whole wasn't really about film. It was still in a period known as the cinema of attraction, which focused more on creating a spectacle for audiences than telling a story. Le Manoir du Diable was not about the bats or the cauldron or the devil. It was about how that man disappeared when he put on a cloak, or how the skeleton turned into a bat when the man hit it with a sword. When 1906 rolled around, it brought in a new perspective to cinema, something referred to academically as the Nickelodeon era of filmmaking, which referred to the nickel theaters that began to pop up. Even during this time period, there were few films created which would fit the modern-day qualifications of horror. The genre would need more time to truly come into its own, but the first inklings of what was to follow began to show. The films of this time period were in black and white and silent, although there would often be accompanying music played live in the theaters. The trends and narrative elements during the Silent Age are similar to those of the age which would succeed it, with films created in this time including the adaptation of many Gothic pieces of literature, such as Edgar Allan Poe, or the 1910 adaptation of Frankenstein, which is not to be confused with the more iconic adaptation of Frankenstein in 1931, starring Boris Karloff. Many silent films would also take inspiration from stage productions, in their theatrics and staging itself of the films. Notable movies from this time include classics like Nosferatu, The Cabinet of Calgary, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and The Phantom of the Opera. The true birth of the horror genre came in the golden age of horror movies. People debate when exactly this took place, but for the sake of this video, I will loosely define it as the late 1920s to sometime in the 1940s. Some people argue that it was only until the 1930s, and that's okay. It doesn't really matter. Some people may also say we are currently in a golden age of horror, but that's just a descriptor. This older period of horror is literally called the golden age of horror, at least for now. This time period is still in black and white, although we start to see films with sound and spoken dialogue.
Ah! What is it? It's there! Something like a monk! A fetish monk!
Horror films largely focused on the pantheon of universal monsters derived from Gothic literature, and it is in this golden age that we see the origin of many classic Halloween costumes such as Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and the Mummy. And yes, Frankenstein is the doctor, not the monster, but if you look up Frankenstein on any cheap Halloween costume website, you won't be finding a lot of lab coats. This was all kicked off by the box office success of Dracula, which led to many sequels and spin-off movies such as Dracula's Daughter, Son of Dracula, and various undeveloped concepts for sequels. This also set the precedence for Universal monster films to have many sequels, such as the franchise of Frankenstein, which had Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, The Ghost of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, which is categorized as a sequel to Frankenstein, not Dracula or Game of Thrones, and finally, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I like to blame this proto-trend as the reason why so many horror movies since the Golden Age have such a high quantity of sequels, but really that's just due to corporate greed, which is arguably far more horrifying. Creatures like Frankenstein and Dracula make up the monster part of the Universal monster, but the part that makes them universal was the company that brought them to the silver screen. Universal Studios ruled the world of horror at this time, finding extreme success with their iconic creatures. Films of this golden age largely relied on the use of many static shots and theater-like staging, giving the feeling of watching a taped stage play rather than the much more motion-based cinematography of the modern day. The effects used were also largely practical, as CGI would not be invented for some time to come. The majority of this period was also produced under the Hays Code, guidelines which restricted the content of movies created. It is due to this reason that a shift was seen between the level of violence depicted in the first Frankenstein movie, made before the Hays Code, and all the sequels made after, which were much more scaled back. The 40s also saw the rise of the magnificent Val Lewton, who introduced the filmmaking technique, the cat scare, when tension is continually raised for a reveal that the thing building it was something harmless like a cat. I've never actually seen a Val Lewton film, but just look at these covers. It's so kitschy. The next big trend in early Hollywood horror films was ushered in by two significant cultural moments: the Cold War and the resulting space race, as humans began to conceive of a life among the stars. In a post-war climate, the United States economy was booming. This led to an increasingly present middle class, and alongside it, the growth of suburbia, as well as investment into activities like going to the theaters. As the Cold War came, it brought with it the Red Scare, which would seep into film. The Red Scare manifested itself in the film industry through the Hollywood Blacklist, a list of creatives who were barred from involvement in the production of movies because of their ties or suspected ties with communism.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. There are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
Films often bore themes of atomic anxieties and the fears that people around you weren't who they appeared to be, like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which aliens duplicate and replicate human beings to establish a presence on Earth before taking it over. They blended in and could be anyone. Anyone could be a secret evil alien who wanted to destroy the world as we know it, just like any of your coworkers could be a secret informant who wanted to destroy your world as you know it. The race to get to space, a side effect of the Cold War as the United States and Russia rushed to be the first to make it out of the atmosphere and onto the moon, led to a big push in technological advancements and a new focus among the general public on the stars. Space became a common backdrop for movies, and the sci-fi genre was brought into a new age. The fears of the technology-fueled attempt to leave the planet were explored throughout horror. Films like The Thing, War of the Worlds, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers defined space race and sci-fi horror. Following the space craze, this era took place from sometime in the 60s to sometime in the 70s. It isn't really called the Silver Age, but I like to think of it as such because this is the time period when we got a lot of really defining horror movies. During the Silver Age, there were two main popular trends in horror, rather than the domination of one prevalent theme as seen in the previous two eras. The first was exploitation films, which are lower-budget B-horror movies and are named after their attempts to exploit current trends in society. They generally had more explicit material, as this trend occurred directly after the end of the Hays Code, which previously restricted what was permitted to be screened in films. These films were also generally viewed as lower quality due to their budget and tendency to just hop on passing trends. Many of these films would end up becoming cult classics, such as Rocky Horror Picture Show, which nowadays you can find midnight screenings for at any indie movie theater. Alongside exploitation films, there was a rise in independent productions following the success of Night of the Living Dead, a film which also marked the solidification of the modern zombie figure and the concept of a zombie apocalypse in pop culture. The second predominant trend was a large focus on psychological horror, as seen in the domination of Hitchcock and movies like Rosemary's Baby. These films would focus on the mental state of both victims and their perpetrators, and most of the fear cultivated in the film would derive from the state. Films during this era were starting to be produced in color and began to emphasize more physical violence, with scenes like the shower scene in Psycho, which famously involves repeated stabbing with a knife, and is widely regarded as one of the most horrifying scenes in film. Following the Second World War, there was an emphasis on suburbia as a method of rebuilding and crafting the nuclear family dream. By the time the 70s and 80s rolled around, the image of the suburbia had solidified as one of safety and security, both economically and in a more concrete, tangible way, as they literally provided shelter and space to their inhabitants. The slasher created a foil to this perfect home, twisting its safety into something threatening and dangerous, with antagonists like Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger. This concentration on the white picket fence as a setting for such horrors showed the anxieties of losing this emblem of safety. This time period also saw the popularization of POV shots, such as the one which opened Halloween, and more movement in the camera itself. The victims of the violence shifted to a younger, teenage demographic, and popularized the now famous horror trope of the final girl, a term coined by Carol J. Clover. In this time period, the final girl was an embodiment of all the ideals associated with suburbia. The final girl was the girl next door, down to earth, and deemed as pure by the narrative. She was a surrogate for everything teens were supposed to be, and through this virtue, was able to survive the story. Aside from just the final girl, this era brought with it many tropes and symbols of horror that people love to point to in attempts to discredit the genre. Like, why did you leave the knife there with the killer? Or, why did she run upstairs instead of running out the front door? Wow, horror movie characters are so dumb! It's just slashers, guys. They had to contrive it so their villains could walk really slowly and look cool. Many of the major films of this time period, like Friday the 13th, Halloween, and A Nightmare on Elm Street, would go on to have a large quantity of sequels, which would become convoluted and confusing, as at the end of each movie, the antagonist would generally die to create a satisfying ending, and then, by the time of the next movie, in the style of Rise of Skywalker, somehow they returned. In the wake of sequel upon sequel of slasher horror movies, the horror genre was becoming very stale. The next shift, which rolled around in the 90s, wasn't focused on the perpetrator of the violence or their victims like many previous changes before, but instead on a tonal shift. Wes Craven's Scream found major success in the 90s for its awareness of these tropes that began to become so convoluted during the slasher era. It used these conventions to add an element of comedy to the film, having characters literally talk about them.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
Following its popularity, the genre became much more aware of itself, making meta jokes and just becoming more conscious of its status as a horror movie. If a previous trend in horror films was introducing the role of the final girl, this trend in horror films marked the acknowledgement of the role of the final girl by the narrative. Horror movies are cool now. They know that the slashers which came before them relied on a lot of tropes and were silly. These new movies aren't like that. They are aware. With the sense of humor the film brought to the genre, there was also a new push for comedy horror films like Shaun of the Dead and Zombieland, two films that both commented on the genre and were comedically focused. Getting closer to modern day, we have the emergence of the infamous torture porn genre, kicked off largely by the Saw franchise. The term torture porn generally refers to an excess of gore and a focus on needless graphic violence. These films are apparently more intellectually referred to as splatter films, but if you talk about splatter films, almost no one is going to know what you are referring to. That sounds like movies set at water parks. Although films of this variety were seen decades prior, the subset of horror really came into its own in the early 2000s. I'll be entirely honest, I couldn't really find a definitive parallel within the culture of the time to say influenced this, but I have seen many people talk about ties to the American War on Terror following the attacks of 9/11. That sounds like it makes sense, which is honestly half of film theory. Things are a lot less objective than people like to make them seem. These films focus less on the antagonistic force, story, or characters, and more on the spectacle of violence. Like a return to form to the days of cinema of attraction, just much longer with a higher level of production quality and hyper-focused on violence. I have to add my personal bias here when I say a lot of the movies looked ugly. And I'm definitely not the only one who thinks so. There were a lot of cheaply made Saw knockoffs with poor lighting and cheap visual effects that haven't aged super well. On a more positive side, the emphasis on gore led to a newfound interest in special effects and resulted in many fascinating advancements in makeup and visual design. The horror genre has always been met with a level of moral condescension, but the proliferation of torture porn, combined with the new age of internet access and personal blogs that read more like personal diaries, led to a new wave of disdain for the genre, with many equating horror as a whole with cheap scares and a lack of creativity. The 2010s brought a string of movies with demonic or supernatural antagonists like Insidious, The Conjuring, The Woman in Black, Sinister, Annabelle, Ouija, Possession, and Oculus. I believe this began due to the popularity of international horror films that had these elements, particularly J-horror films such as The Ring and its American remake in the early 2000s, as well as the remake of The Grudge in 2004. International remakes weren't the only kind though, as this era also brought with it a lot of remakes of horror films in general. This was seen in one of three ways. The capital R remake, which just remade the first film, generally with some kind of twist or element that set it vaguely apart, that usually fell flat. The prequel film, made decades after the original, that added to the story and the setup of the first film, taking place before its events. And the requel, a trend which came more in the late 2010s with films like Halloween 2018. These requels generally served as a direct sequel to the first or second films of a franchise, negating the films that originally came after. This was done to bring a wider audience into the theater, so viewers didn't feel like they had to watch all 200 sequels of a franchise to understand the plot and the fact that this random character matters because they are the adopted stepsister of the professor who studied the killer and secretly was actually a cult leader who wanted to dissect the antagonist, but wait, she doesn't know that he was actually framed and was good the whole time. There were also a lot of plain sequels made during this era too, though they generally underperformed. All these remakes and sequels were easy ways for studios to tap into the beloved franchise they already owned, knowing that they came with a built-in viewer base and would therefore be a safer investment and more likely to turn a profit. This was not really a major trend, but it is a recent micro-trend that I find very interesting. During the 2020 public health crisis, the necessity of social distancing meant productions had to adapt and find ways to create movies in the new reality they found themselves in. The most famous example from this brief era of filmmaking was Host, but many more horror movies were created during this time period. It is a particularly interesting micro-trend because it pushed for horror films to be created on a smaller budget. It is hard to say what the current trend in horror is, as it is actively being lived out, but one recent trend in horror is a focus on pretty horror movies and a more overt focus on social justice themes. This is also referred to as high art horror or elevated horror. These elevated horror films focus on the more artistic aspects of filmmaking, the kind of movie that people will write 10 paragraphs about on Letterboxd and respond to any criticism with, "You just didn't get the film." They also tend to have a poignant, overarching theme or commentary on society, like the exploitation of animals in Hollywood or the societal shunning of women as they lose their more youthful bodies. This artistry can be seen in many prolific horror directors in the modern age, such as Jordan Peele and Ari Aster. Many of these huge horror movies in the past few years have been distributed by the independent entertainment company A24, which both produces films as well as acts as a distributor for films. Midsommar, Bodies, 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 The Vavitch, Hereditary, and Pearl are all films that A24 produced or distributed. Blumhouse is another huge studio in horror currently, with some more popular and respected horror films, and some that are a little less loved.
Your turn. Truth or dare?
Blumhouse created some big names of horror in recent years, such as Megan, Unfriended, Happy Death Day, and the particularly acclaimed Peele film,
Get out.
Honestly, I think this trend is rising because people are starting to realize the capacity of horror to explore complex ideas. Horror inherently brings a visceral feeling to any topic. It is the nature of the genre and a symptom of exploiting such instinctual emotions such as fear and disgust. This added intensity inherent to the genre can be a powerful tool in eliciting a response from viewers, and therefore tying this depth of response to the theme of the story as a whole. Art horror challenges the perception of the entire horror genre, especially coming so soon after the era of torture porn and underexposed fever dream films of the 2000s and early 2010s. In a way, this trend feels reminiscent of the meta-horror of the 90s and early 2000s. The genre is once again aware of itself and pushing back against what it has been in the past and the way it has been perceived. Okay, I did it. Can I have my cookies back? Thanks for the cookies.
They were delicious.